We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.
Paul McCartney is alive and well, and as he puts it, unconcerned about the rumors of his death.
Any parent can testify the lifestyle of the Beatles has always been somewhat different. And if you believe current rumor, their style of revealing Paul McCartney's alleged death is being carried out with singular taste.
Paul doesn't have shoes on.
To some, that is a death symbol. Now, there he is. He walks, he talks, he sings. Paul McCartney of the Beatles. He finally got in front of a camera in Glasgow today to put an end to the speculation that he is no longer among the living. He is. And now the whole world has been apprised of that fact.
Is Paul McCartney alive or dead? Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday. James Paul McCartney was born on the 18th of June, 1942, in Liverpool. Now at the age of 27, he is either a millionaire Beatle with a beautiful wife, or he's dead, and has been for about 2 years. According to the rumours, he is supposed to have died in a car crash in 1966. The controversy surrounding Paul McCartney was recently the subject of an hour-long report on radio. 5AD's Martin Smith presents the evidence.
Started in Detroit. A group of university students were playing tapes backwards and forwards, different speeds. They gave their evidence to a disc jockey in Detroit. His name was Russ Gibb. And together, collectively, they thought Paul McCartney had died. I understand they still do. So people throughout the world then started listening to what has happened. The Beatles have made no live appearances for 3 years. There have been no records for a certain period of time in 1966. When Paul was supposed to have died, I understand he went to Africa at the time, but maybe he did have an accident of some sort. Anyway, the first record that came out after the lull of activity from Apple Records was Strawberry Fields Forever, which I understand Strawberry Fields is a graveyard on a hillside in Liverpool. Other people have told me it's an orphanage down the road from where John Lennon lived, but I think we're both right. I think if they check out this world, Strawberry Fields is definitely a cemetery overlooking Liverpool. The first LP to come out about the same time as Strawberry Fields was the Sgt. Pepper album. The cover of this, as well as some of the songs on it, is very interesting. If you look at the minute detail which is on there, you can find that the Beatles are actually gathered around what looks like a grave. This could be the grave they buried them old sound of music in. That could be the grave they buried Paul in. He's standing head and shoulders above the rest. He's meant to be a lot shorter. Around his wax model from Madame Tussauds are heads of Marlon Brando, who made a tragic death in The Wild One, and also Tom Mix. He died in a car accident. On the back of the album, Paul has his back to us. On the inside photos, the initials OPD are on his arm. Does that mean O. Paul is dead? There's a guitar with left-handed strings, left-handed guitar on the around the grave. He was a left-handed four-string guitarist. So there you are. It goes from one thing to the other. And also, musically on the record, at the very end, when the needle is running over the dead surface area, waiting to be taken back by the arm, well, then there's a little bit there which caught our attention, and it could be, will Paul be back as Superman? Forwards, it doesn't sound like anything too much, but perhaps backwards, that does come out. There are certain things on the Magical Mystery Tour album as well, visually and music-wise, which proved interesting. For instance, you can look at some of the photos. We were just mentioning Superman. There's a photo in there of Paul as Superman, with Superman at the driving wheel. Paul thought he was the driver. There's also a couple of shots of Paul without his shoes on, which is the mark of a corpse in Italy, the shoes to the side of him. And the last album, which has been released here in Australia, the Abbey Road album, probably musically, we haven't been able to find too much yet. People have read certain things into certain tracks so far. But certainly the cover is rather fascinating. You have the four Beatles walking across Abbey Road, which is where the EMI recording studios are in London, where they record. John Lennon is dressed as a religious figure. Following him is Ringo. He's dressed as an undertaker. Then you've got McCartney. He's out of step and barefoot and dressed in a normal suit, the mark of the corpse again. And then follows up George Harrison as a kind of hippie gravedigger dressed in jeans. Whether this has any significance, I don't know. My theory is, for what it's worth, that Paul was close to dying at some stage. And now, when it's all over and he is better, they, and especially John Lennon, who is known to have this cynical mind, can look back on it and make one big joke out of it.
I told you about the war is a mean man. You know that's where it goes to see me, man. Well, here's another to be wrong. The war is with Paul.
He wasn't there, that he didn't sing part of it or so on, but somebody else was singing at a time when the fans and when the label would indicate that it was Paul McCartney.
What you just heard was a compilation, excuse me, I'm having a challenging time in my chest and throat this morning. What you heard is a compilation of audio clips that are mostly from the 60s. The first one was Howard K. Smith, the American newscaster, and he was talking about the life of Paul McCartney. At that time, he was essentially saying that Paul, who had been in absentia amidst a number of rumors that he had passed away, finally surfaced in Glasgow with a press conference. And then the other fellow you were listening to was, I think his name was Martin Smith, believe it or not. And he was a researcher for the BBC, reporter for the BBC, talking about a lot of the clues that the Beatles had theoretically left, especially John and George, about what had happened with Paul McCartney. It is one of the great mysteries of pop culture, and still to this day, it is a hotly debated topic amongst Beatles and non-Beatles fans. In fact, even questioning the fact that Paul McCartney, or this version of Paul McCartney, is different than the original Paul, is a sacrilege to most Beatle fans and is summarily laughed away. But today we're going to go pretty deep with this, and we're going to bring on Clare Kuehn, who is a researcher and writer from Canada, and she has looked fairly deeply into the Paul is dead experience, along with a few other subjects which we may touch on today, particularly JFK, where I think there is a huge tie-in and I've written about this on my site, and there's a few things that I'll bring up later with Claire, but we're going to avail ourselves of her expertise. She is a medieval scholar and has turned her superb research skills towards more contemporary and even futuristic material and media. So let's bring her on and welcome Clare Kuehn.
Hi, am I there?
Yeah, hey Claire, how are you?
Hi, do you go by Rob or Robert?
Robert is okay, Rob is fine. Just let's stay away from Bob. That's the only thing.
Okay.
It's the only no-fly zone with me is Bob. I used to be Bob.
No-fly zoning. Sanctions. Yeah. Well, hi to your audience. It's nice to be invited. Thanks a lot. I guess I'll call you Rob if you like that.
That's fine. It makes us feel just a little more familiar without having really known each other. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I just want to get it right?
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be on your show. That was a great intro. I had no idea you were going to do that. That's good. That sets me up fine. This topic, I actually have to say, as I said in my broadcast on, my voice is a little funny too, my broadcast for Dr. Jim Fetzer at the Real Deal radio show, there's archives. It was January 4th. He finally had me on after about a year and a half of and another person sort of pestering about this. And he's very much a Beatles fan, but he's a Paul McCartney adorer. And so he had the kind of resistance to even really looking at it that he criticizes others, in other areas of and I understand, nobody wants to be crazy. Nobody wants to be taken for a ride and get something wrong, make a mistake.
Right.
But after a while, he said, it seems as though there's something here, and I want you to come on. So in January 4th this year, I came on, and that's how actually you got connected to me. I'm just filling your audience in because a listener to that show is also, I guess, a listener to your show. He's a person from Liverpool, a Liverpudlian named Darren Williams. He's a researcher in his own right. He goes anywhere in research, and sometimes I think goes a little uncarefully. Sometimes he's really careful. I try to be very, very careful, but extremely open-minded. I'll read anything. I've gotten to that point where I actually can hold my nose and read anything. It took me a couple of years to be willing to do that, but I now will read anything, and I have looked very deeply into this issue and into other issues that some of which pan out and some of which don't. For instance, the idea that Elvis didn't die. Somebody recently slammed me and suggested, well, Elvis is seen in donut shops, so. And here I was talking about forensics and photos and situations, and he's going, Elvis, yeah. So the thing is I am very careful, and I think that actually scares some people. It actually scared Jim about the topic. He's now recognizing there is quite a good prima facie case for this to have occurred, and that doesn't, mean that other things necessarily occurred, but at least that this may have occurred. So that's sort of where Jim has come to, even though he doesn't quite believe it or want to believe it. And he'll admit that. So that's sort of, it's wonderful you played those clips. So if I can go through some of that, or if you want to just ask questions, how would you like to do this?
Well, sure. Let's just do this. I want you to go through some of the clips, and I will also want to sort of go back in time and revisit. Let's go to the point in time where theoretically Paul disappears, and because there seems to be, and I've read that there are at least two accounts to this. There's the one account where there was a car crash, and Penny Lane and Rita is involved in the car crash somehow. There's that account, and then there's the other account where he dies with Brian Epstein. I don't know if you've heard that account as well, but there are two out there, and I'd love to get your take on those two accounts and really sort of the inception of where this begins, and then we can talk about that intro if you like, or we can just continue to go with where you go. But let's start there.
Okay, yeah. First of all, yeah, we have to set up the fact that there is an historical period in which, if this happened, there was an opportunity. because otherwise people don't realize there was actually a period of time, as you mentioned, that in the historical record as it is accepted, there is a sort of a missing Paul, at least a sort of a missing Paul. It's from it's actually from early September, late August 1966, through to December 1966. In that period, the claim is made that Paul was in Africa, in Kenya, in the Ikishi Highlands, having a trip. At first, he went to France and that area with Mal Evans, who was one of the two main roadies with the Beatles. They hung out. They were a bit used and abused by these guys. They're not perfect guys. I am a fan of their music, but I am aware of, they're not perfect, okay? So I'm not coming in this as an attacker of the Beatles, and I'm also not coming in as just an adorer, okay? So anyway, so during that period, Paul had made an appearance at the Melody Makers Awards. I think it was in late August, early September, I'm forgetting right now. And then there is actually no mention of him. There are articles from that period in which there are former photos of the Beatles, like used news stock of photos, but there's no actual current photos of him. Mm-hmm. John went down into Spain. He was making actually a really good movie called How I Won the War. Mm-hmm. And George went to India. And Ringo kind of traveled to see John, and then I think I forget what he did. Now, when Paul gets back from this trip, there are photos of him returning from the plane. He is taller, okay? And we know this from other photos where we can have very good comparisons. Some photos, depending on lens distortion and where people are standing, you have to be very careful how you judge height. You have to judge it in a proportional way, hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder. You have to take into account proportion, changing, perspective. But anyway, so he's slightly different. And then he talks, I think it was on the BBC or something, and he's fiddling with his mustache, which seems to be falling off, seems to be pushing it back. A little later, you have some of the songs. One of the songs says, backwards, it says, it was a fake mustache, it was a fake mustache. And you do have a fake mustache in the Sgt. Pepper's album that came out in 1967 as part of the cutouts. You had a Sgt. Pepper, you had a fake mustache, you had there's a number of things, you could cut out and paste on. It was sort of an interactive little album. That was the next year. So there is this historical period where he's gone, and they don't hear from him. And during that period, a lot of newscasters and into the early next year were sort of like, where is Paul? He did appear briefly, but like, where is he? And then, as you mentioned, he is up in Glasgow, and the BBC approached him, and he was really furious, actually. And then he said, if I take all of your tapes and destroy them, I will do you an interview. Then he did an interview. So he didn't want the impromptu footage of himself coming out. Now, that doesn't prove anything on itself. What it is it's an opportunity if such a thing happened. And unfortunately, by February 1967, there was a disclaimer in the Beatles book Fan magazine, which at that point only came out in England. So again, this isn't a very wide thing. And it said, there is a rumor that Paul McCartney died in a car crash on the M1, but he's here, he says he's fine, we've checked, blah, blah, blah. There's this little blurb. So when this blew up as a supposedly just nutty bunch of students in the U.S. looking at album covers in 1969, which is when it next surfaced, and then it became a worldwide phenomenon, the claim was, oh, well, maybe he's recently dead, or, why have they been playing with this? Are they just having fun with us? But actually, the first disclaimer was back in 1967. Now, you could say that they were starting to plant weird clues, or you could say they were already fighting a street rumor and then acting as if it had just happened in sort of a half disinfo, as if it had just happened in February, January, when in fact the real rumor was that he had died in September.
Right. Yeah.
So there is this little hint evidence that it goes back that far. Just to have the audience be aware. This isn't something that was just spuriously made up in 1969 when it blew up in the U.S.
Right.
Which I didn't know.
It had been going on for a while. What do you make of the Paul lookalike contest that was held on American Bandstand? Are you aware of this?
I'm aware there's a claim there was. I haven't actually seen that they did it. I've seen that there's a claim that there was such a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I try to stay away from things that I don't know for sure. What we can say is that when this took off in 1969, and what happened was a guy calling himself Tom, he called into a Detroit radio station. Detroit was much more of a center for music through the 20th century than L.A. was. It still really was very much a center for music at that point. Mm-hmm. And he called into this Detroit radio station and said, "Hey, I've been hearing from friends that Paul is dead. What's this all about?" And Russ Gibb, who was the DJ, said, "I don't know." And he played Revolution 9 backwards, and he thought he heard "Turn Me On, Dead Man, Turn Me On, Dead Man." Now, we do know that the Beatles did put backwards messages or statements and funny, weird things in. We have people commenting on that. But the question is, when you're interpreting backwards messages, can you really hear it? They're usually a little garbled, and some of them, they're really unclear. What I like to focus on is there's a forward message in A Blue Jay Way by George Harrison, in which, now you don't get it in the mono re-release. You do get it in the sort of faux stereo that they put out and in the movie. And what it actually says is they start singing. He says, "There's a fog upon L.A.," and then the background is Paul, and then he says, "And my friends have lost their way," and then the background is died. And then they say, "We'll be over soon," they said. Paul is very... but they've lost themselves instead. And then it says bloody. Now, the only part of that is kept in the mono, right? But what's very interesting is it actually is a forward message in there. So if I can actually kind of take this into a realm where it's easier to talk about, it would be easier to talk about the fact that this does not all depend on clues that may or may not be in the album covers. And it does not depend only on, people thinking they, see things mythologically. That's part of it. I thought that was all of it. When I first looked at this issue personally, I thought this is going to be a good example of how people really do make up and build something up more than it is. And I found that though there is a bit of that actually, in this case, there seems actually to be a case, and it goes way beyond the clues.
Let me stop you there for 1 second.
Sure.
Okay? So that line from Blue Jay Way, okay? When did that come out? What was the year on that?
That was in Magical Mystery Tour. The album, right? No, what do you call it? What is the album for Magical? Yeah, Sergeant Pepper's. Wait a minute. Where's the Magical Mystery Tour? No, Magical Mystery Tour is the album, right?
It is the album. It's its own album.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
Right.
And then it was featured in the film. And in those days when they did stereo, they did what's kind of called a false stereo. So it's like it was like a splitting of the mono. It wasn't actually a stereo yet because most people didn't have stereo. So technology changes. I don't have a copy of the original mono, so I don't know if this re-release of the mono, they've taken it out. I do know that in the original movie and in the original LP of the stereo, you do hear that. So it actually makes the song diminished not to have it because it's actually part of the notes. I mean, they're actually singing part of the background notes when they sing this. So to try to take it out kind of diminishes the song for me, but so yeah.
So it came out, Magical Mystery Tour came out in 1967. Okay.
Right, late 67.
Yeah. It came out in December 67. Now, in that line, George mentions L.A.
Yes, he does.
Okay. Now, I think this is an important piece that you're going to touch on.
You're right.
because now there's going to be a whole slew of connections with Los Angeles, the Process Church, the Manson family. This is where you're going, right?
Yeah, that's part of where you go with this. So first, so do hold on to that. First, it would be good to quickly make the case about Paul's death, and then we can discuss the ramifications for research. Because if you actually wake up to, or shall we say, come to the conclusion, I'll be neutral, that Paul died, then you have a question of how, under what circumstances, why, and what is required then? Well, it's required that you fool yourself or somehow you didn't look closely enough, and of course no one likes that feeling. And number two, who would be involved in helping the Beatles cover this up? Who would convince them to? Because I have a feeling that John, who was already a bit addled with drugs in early 67 and late 66, right, that he may have been so overwhelmed by the loss of his friend that someone getting to him and saying, look, if you keep the band together, now this is me suggesting this, but I think that that's the kind of pressure that was put on, and it's sort of, you waffle, you go, oh no, well, it would never, well, no, that's bad. And then it's beginning to happen before you really have said no. And at that point, it begins to take on a life of its own. And that would involve also intelligence. Right. It would involve MI5 or, and we know that not every police person has to know everything.
Tavistock might have a role in this as well, right?
Might. That's another thing. I try to be very careful about the Tavistock stuff because Tavistock is very real, and they do mind control, and that's a whole other issue, how we know that and how real mind control is, how far it can go, and all of that stuff. And I've done some shows on that. But the issue about Tavistock and the Beatles is that some people go so far as to claim that the Beatles were a created band. They were created for mind control. They were under mind control themselves. They were manipulators and all of that. Now, I think that the way that they may have been gotten to was through this death. I have a feeling that it was around that period that they were experimenting, if you want to say with the Process Church, but not necessarily that, that they became actually, they seem to have become supporters of a version of Crowleyite cultism. Now, this is very hard for most people to swallow. I mean, when you talk about that, you have to realize a lot of people who are into these things are into them out of some kind of a resentment from regular religion, which has its flaws, okay? And they're also into it not necessarily because they want to do a lot of evil, but because Crowley's talk, at the time anyway, was one of the sort of, you can be enlightened on your own, the world is magical, you have power in yourself. If you go that route, it's not all bad. He's not entirely a complete, mess up. Crowley says some things that are true about human nature, but he mixes it with a lot of negativity, and he was a British agent, we know that, and he was into Satanism and horrible things. That
Crowley was a necromancer, and in addition to all that stuff. So, there's the Crowley connection for sure. And this emerges really right around 67. This is when it all...
Yeah, Sgt. Pepper's, they start to... And in Yellow Submarine, for instance, in Yellow Submarine, in the movie, Ringo at one point is at the window of the submarine, and they're singing When I'm 64, and there's clocks going up on the outside of the submarine in the animated feature. And one of the clocks very quickly, like as it goes up very quickly, is actually an image of a kind of a semi-friendly looking purple devil with horns and so on, and he has a big ring on, Ringo, right? And he gives the two finger up, the first and last finger up salute, which is kind of a double horned god symbol, of I mean, what it exactly means to them is many things, but it's if you want to call it a satanic symbol. We have to be very careful because not all Satanists see themselves as what we think of as Satanists, red robes, and black horns and stuff. Some of them are, if you will, believing that they're actually helping, and they wouldn't call themselves Satanists. They'd call themselves, freedom lovers, and they wouldn't. So these terms get switched around. Now, the Process Church is very interesting because Process Church seems to have been if you will, an intelligence cult. It was created partly through some guys in Britain and the U.S. who were intelligence people. We now know this connection. Jim Fetzer actually did a show that had this on it, and I've seen the interviews about this. That they were creating this idea that Jehovah is sort of, the big bad sort of hardliner. Jesus is sort of the nice guy, ineffectual. And Satan is the power of humanity and growth and, if you will, all the good stuff. But along with it comes our bad side. And so they're, in effect, creating a situation in which adherents might, justify a lot of their infantile, amoral or immoral behavior as, well, this is part of the world, so it's okay. So Satan is a kind of if you will, a trickster figure in the process church stuff. And so anyway, the issue is, we're seeming to go far afield. I think for anyone who wants to know more about what was going on in LA with cults, with fake bands, with intelligence, and with people who may or may not have known their whole role, people would want to go to the amazing 21 or 22 long web pages. Sorry, they're not perfect. He says they're not perfect, but he does a really good job of going through the stuff. It's Dave McGowan, McGowan, and the piece is called Inside the LC, The Strange but Mostly True Story of Laurel Canyon and the Birth of the Hippie Generation. And in there, though he rambles through some stuff and he's not quite sure about some of it, themes come up again and again and again, and he marshals all kinds of testimonials and films and bios and where the bios come.
His research is impeccable too, by the way. I mean, it's really amazingly done research. Yeah, and it's really, if you want to look at the Rosetta, for me, inside the Laurel Canyon is the Rosetta Stone. What happened in the 60s, and that the 60s were no accident, and that there was a lot of pre-planning as a massive planetary inception, which took place between the years of 1960, specifically 1967 and 1969, which, by the way, coincides with the tightest conjunctions between Pluto and Uranus in the sign of Virgo from an astrological standpoint. And so you have the beginning of the 60s, and I'd love for you to chime in on this too, because I think that there's some interesting correlations. We're kind of getting a little far field. We'll bring it back to Paul, but there's some interesting correlations between the Beatles and the Stones. And and the Beatles, for me, in terms of this whole Crowley-esque arc, the Beatles for me are decidedly Luciferian. Okay, and I think that there is a difference between the Luciferian and the Satanic paradigms. And the Stones are satanic. I mean, they even say, they've got an album, The Satanic Majesties, their Satanic Majesty's Request. So these two bands, which are very important, are playing out these two, not even disparate, but two related aspects of sort of this anti-Christian theology. And the Stones themselves, the Beatles bring on the Summer of Love, and the Stones end it in 1969 with Altamont. And both bands have these very tight connections. Well, certainly for the Stones with Los Angeles and Kenneth Anger, and the Beatles with the Process Church and some of the stuff we're talking about. Let's get back into the Paul piece. And I want to know from you where you take the death of Paul, the rise of fall, and how it relates specifically to LA and how they get there from the emergence of this new character who looks, for all intents and purposes, like he has been chosen to be the way shower in this new direction for the Beatles.
Well, in order to really understand it and understand it with sympathy, sympathetic fairness to the people involved, and always in conspiracy research, literal conspiracies, I don't just mean kooky stuff, you have to think what was moving the people involved, because they are individuals as much as they can be characterized as part of a group or part of a meme, part of an idea. So what seems to have happened is that and we haven't gotten into the evidence for this, but if Paul died and probably was murdered, if this is the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that John and George and Ringo knew right away he was murdered. They might have. Under their shock and horror, it seems as though they were manipulated and are already being manipulated. They're already at least John was very anti-Christian. But again, he never was anti the Christ message. What he was against the formalist Christian dogma stuff, which was...
So John says some very interesting and compelling stuff, but I think was taken out of context during that time.
Yes. Well, it wasn't. People have commented that people in the U.S., some of the people in the U.S., were much more religion literalists than in Britain. In Britain, it was almost like the Church of England was very much a social thing. It had become like you could really say whatever you want. They had a long tradition of kind of atheism and experientialism and so on, and these people could say what they wanted to, and yet they better not say it after tea and crumpets. They better not do it in an anti-social way. So John, said some stuff like, the Beatles are right now bigger than Jesus, meaning a lot of people are following this stuff. They like us, and he liked being liked, and a very personable person, and that kind of stuff. And he was very much a reader. I mean, John was an intellectual. Though he was an artist, non-intellectual, he was also a smart cookie. And he denied being an intellectual because in his circles, of course, that meant a fuddy-duddy. He wasn't a fuddy-duddy, but he was a very, very deeply smart person. And so he was reading stuff, as we do, sort of reading all kinds of theses about, did Christ really live? What is religion? He was also, of course, primally very damaged, and he later went to Janoff to help try to heal that in L.A., the Primal Center. And so in this period where that was yet several years in the future, he had no idea. He was pursuing religion, as he would later say, God is an image that by which we measure our pain. So he was into religion as this kind of, like, the world is magical, the world is great, but I don't want to be in a formal religion. Now, in that sense, he would be very anti-Christ, especially the more he was attacked for bringing up issues about Christianity. So I think that that's where that got pushed, and I do think that they got a little bit into this, if you will, you want to call it Luciferian. Some people wouldn't understand that, but I'm glad you said, it's a different kind of a tradition that's related to the Crowley stuff. It's kind of what I was pointing to when I said that Crowley's or any kind of spiritualism has a side to it that is magical, it's beautiful, mysterious, and a little bit about power, about your own personal power, and that's sort of, if you will, the more positive possibility. And then there's this more negative, as you called it, satanic, but I use the term satanic because I wanted to put it into the category where we are talking about some people who are necromancers and literally bad Satanists who are running some of these ideas. Crowley was a mix. So in 1966, when Paul sort of disappears for a trip, supposedly, here's this rumor admitted in early 67, or planted. Some people say, oh, it's planted. It's another false clue. But by 67, then out comes Sgt. Pepper. They're dressed completely differently. They have mustaches. There's a lot of photo doctoring. There's this thing about Sgt. Pepper and the fake mustache and the cutouts and all that stuff. And yes, it was psychedelic, but it also seems to have been to make the change between the Pauls less obvious. You're noticing not so much the difference in Paul. You're more assuming he's the same guy and thinking, okay, here's this phantasmagoria that's going on. Now, you mentioned L.A. L.A. was a hotbed of intelligence and that's a very broad term, but military intelligence, people who were children of military psychology departments, and at that point we now know they were doing mind control, which at that point nobody else knew. To remember, at the point where these people are being preyed upon, they don't all know quite what's going on, right? So you kind of go back.
There seems to be two kind of vectors. There's like the John Phillips vector, where he seems to be actually quite aware of what he has done and what he's doing. And then there's like the Stephen Stills vector, who, you know, it looks like he might have been part of some special forces unit in Vietnam and has been kind of wiped a little bit, but yet he tells people about it. And then there are people that are just going along for the ride and being sort of manipulated, you know, as just a matter of fact. Yeah. But yes, and I think what you brought up earlier, and we need to talk about this. Detroit was really a very happening place for music. You had Motown, which was, you know, huge. You had people like Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, you know, Rare Earth, the MC5. I mean, all these great, you know, scenes are coming out of Detroit. And LA was mostly a music town. I mean, I'm sorry, a movie town. And then all of a sudden, like overnight almost, you know, the clubs open. You know, the studios are releasing records from, you know, in a much bigger way from LA, and it happens, you know, almost instantaneously. And I think that this goes to your point around some of this intelligence stuff that McGowan talks about. And then, you know, as we're headed there, the Beatles are matriculating, you know, towards that place.
Yeah, and John actually said, you know, we're a real band. He actually said that. And I think that that's telling. I think they genuinely were people who were highly intelligent in their musical capacity as an art form, and also just in general, you know, very aware and wanted to be a band. They were, if you will, a real garage band. You know, they were a real homegrown talent. They were promoted through Brian Epstein. Brian, who later dies, that's another issue I wanted to raise. But you know, they seem to be, if you will, a genuine phenomenon. And there were people piggybacking on that and creating it as more of a phenomenon. Then Kennedy dies. When Kennedy was murdered, the Beatles are invited over and given, if you will, a royal treatment on the, what do you call it, show? What's his name now? Thank you. I almost said Arsenio Hall, and I was like, no, God, wrong era. So, and he actually says, you know, Elvis has sent his greetings. They gave them 3 Sundays in a row or something. You know, they like, this was like really promoting them. Now, Ed Sullivan has his own interesting connections to intelligence, but we have to remember, again, connections to intelligence doesn't mean you're a paid agent that knows everything. You're not necessarily a nasty conspirator. You may be a conspirator accomplice who is suggested that, you know, people need something to lift themselves up, you know, maybe we should promote this. You don't necessarily know everything about the plan or the hope of those that are, you could say, handling you or using you in the stable of possibilities. So they're promoted, and I don't know that John and the rest knew at that point. Maybe they'd been approached by MI5 saying, you know, you're really good for Britain and all this, and in their own, you know, slapdash way may have said, but kind of liked the attention. By the point where they're getting really, really famous, they would have been approached by more and more and more people, and those people in their circles, you know, would have been a combination, if they're intelligent, it would have been a combination of people who really, yes, as you said, really know, really have a plot, really want to be doing this, and others who kind of, you know, they report back, or they think it's good to keep tabs, you know, they think they're helping. So you get this combination everywhere. Always have to remember the combination. It's not a bunch of people in sunglasses and capes wandering around being spooks, and that's something that usually conspiracy researchers are tarred with, is this, well, there's this plot, you know, and you're saying that everybody's wandering. No, actually it's a much more complex individual, you know, combinations of things. But forgot where I was going with that. Oh, you said L.A. and Detroit, right?
One of the things also is interesting is that With the Beatles was released on the day that Kennedy was killed in Canada. It was his North American debut.
Yeah.
So there's this, and it's a fascinating connection between the Beatles and Kennedy. And in fact, if you go to the White Album is released on 11/22 in 1968, which is the 5-year anniversary of Kennedy. And then, of course, Revolution 1, Revolution 9. So there's this, the nation is experiencing this trauma, this collective trauma, and then what's inserted right during that trauma? It's the Beatles.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
I don't think there's no coincidence that that's occurring at that time, by the way.
No, it's like Kubrick wanted his Eyes Wide Shut. Not that it's a great film, but he wanted his basically expose of cultic control and mind control to come out on the exact anniversary of the Apollo landings. Right. So that doesn't mean necessarily there weren't necessarily actual flights, but for Apollo at that point, there may or may not have been, but that the claimed photos and the claimed video to film has plenty of earmarks of having been done by Kubrick. And there's an amazing article about that on actually Jim Fetzer's assassinationscience.com site, which is mostly about Kennedy's death. But in there is an article on the sidebar about did Stanley Kubrick fake the Apollo moon landings, and it's actually a brilliant article because in the background of most of the photos and the films is this split level where you have like a hillock in front, and in behind you have this big panorama, but in the panorama are what do you call it? Blurry striations, which also occur in Kubrick's movies, because at that point they didn't have blue screen development. What they used was
front screen projection. Which is what Jay Weidner.
That's it. Yeah.
I don't know if you heard the interview that I did with Jay, but we spent almost 2 hours deconstructing the front screen projection, the Kubrick stuff, and
oh, good. Okay, so I don't have to explain that to the audience. They can go, and also Jim Fetzer had him on.
My audience is pretty savvy, so they're pretty on this stuff. But getting back to the Beatles thing and Paul and going to LA, I just wanted to. For me, I think it's important to understand the connection with the Beatles and Kennedy, especially in this milieu of collective trauma and the insertion of a new meme, or not even a new meme, but it's actually a new order with the Beatles in this vacuum and in this psychological and spiritual void where most of America is absolutely mourning, and all of a sudden they're hit with this shockwave from Liverpool and the amount of media that was focused on in the timing of the albums and the whole 9 yards. It was like, okay, here is the death of one order of being, and now you're getting ready to be introduced to a new order of being. And by that time, really, too, by 1963, 64, even 65, Elvis, as an individual, and the individual performer, is starting to tail off. And now this whole notion of the group or the collective, which is a very Aquarian model, and Kennedy being, in some ways, King Arthur and Camelot, that would be also kind of a recreation of the death of the Piscean Age with the individual, and Kennedy is being sacrificed. And now we have the birth of the New Age, and these four lads from Liverpool and their luciferic sort of message to the world, and then we're going to get there. And then there's this whole thing with LA, because that's where it really takes off. When do the Beatles, in your research, actually show up in Los Angeles, and what are the connecting nodes between the Beatles and LA and this new version of Paul?
Well, I don't know when they first traveled there. They did a Seattle show in late '66. They were touring like crazy in those years, 64, 65, 66. They really were tired. That was, of course, used as the reason why they stopped touring, but it seems to have instead been more that Paul died. So I don't know when they first actually visited L.A., but by the point where it's after '66, they were spending parts of their time in L.A. They're hanging out in L.A. They were, John said they were repeatedly at, Doris Day's home, Doris Day is connected to intelligence probably as a victim even more than as a participant. She may or may not have been replaced. We have to, I think that the people who aren't used to the idea that Paul may actually have died, and there's evidence for that, we should go into that before we go into the other connections. It just seems that, first if you establish that it's likely, then people can move forward. I mean, these are the more interesting, consequent questions that you're asking, and they are where I was led. But first you have to say, did he die, right? Paul actually was, he was a fairly short guy, very, very lithe, Lithe, and live. He was very lively. He was also a fairly wide bone structure face with a narrow jaw, narrow for his face. He had very crunched teeth. His upper teeth show in several photos. Now, never mind that he also, around the time of the Rain promo film, was the song Rain. They did a promo film, and he'd just been in a motorcycle accident, and he chipped a tooth. So that's not, proof of his looking horrible. He just chipped a tooth. But he had very crunched teeth. And there are two forensic experts who, most people who are in the debunker mode rather than a skeptical, seeing if they debunk it mode, they have in Italy. They came out in Wired magazine in 2009, I think in August or September, and they said we thought we could easily debunk this. What we found is the more work we did on it, the clearer it was. This guy, even scientifically, even in very careful considerations, cannot be the same man. And what they said is that, for one thing, if you have just isolated issue, if you have very, very small palate and your teeth grow in all kind of wonky, you can put a plate over it, but it would be quite obvious that you have a plate over your teeth because they're so wonky. Or you can have palatal surgery. And they could do it in 1966. It was very bloody. You'd wear a head brace for about a year. You had to split your whole inner palate, open it up. Now, you wouldn't do this for a singer, and we know he didn't have that. We have news photos and him talking. He wasn't wearing a head brace. So that's eliminated as an option, just in historical record. And yet he surfaces with teeth that are just fine. So he seems to, even on that, just never mind his whole head, seems to have a wider palette after 67. They compared photographs of Paul, very carefully selected. They did initially go to the Paul is Dead forums and stuff to see if there were early photos. They said it's very hard to get good photos of Paul McCartney early, and they're quite shocked at that. And there are all these promo photos, but they're not really good quality. And it turns out that the second Paul has been buying up all kinds of stuff. We have photographers saying that they've had Paul try to buy their stuff. They've had break-ins trying to steal their negatives and all kinds of things. So it's usually presented as if Paul just wants the memorabilia for the future, but actually it seems to be a buy-up. Now, so what these two did is they took two very good photos. They're frontal. They're and almost exactly the same head position. The jaw is mostly closed in both of them. Very little lens distortion because they're frontal and the lens is right in front. It's about the same lens distortion. And then they compared those to many, many photos of the later Paul. And what they found is that certain types of measurements compared to other certain types of measurements, even allowing for, millimeter here or something, they change radically. So it isn't just that, his forehead looks bigger because he tipped his head. We're talking about, if you account for the fact he's tipping his head or he's not tipping his head, the forehead to the, from the center between the eyes down to the bottom of the nose, which you cannot adjust with plastic surgery, because plastic surgery, there's only so far you could raise your nose, because your nose is actually attached to a very small bone there. You can change other things and give the impression of a wider face or a narrower face, but if you actually take the literal, combination, proportional measurements, and say, okay, these proportions show up as, let's say, 3 to 2.5 or whatever millimeters, then you compare it to the original Paul, they're radically different. Like, they're radically different. It's this many millimeters. It's this many millimeters more than the cheek to cheek, or this many millimeters more than the nose to the center of the eyes. And at that point, they said, this is a different guy. Now, it's been attacked. It's been very attacked. One of the people is Gary Anderson, who wrote I Am the Walrus, the Paul is Dead clues. He has a website called Gary J. Anderson. And he has one page in which he says he asked his friend who works at the body farm, which is where they, decompose bodies for forensics and other things, whether this is possible. And the guy said, no, you can't do any forensic analysis from photographs, which is wrong. But anyway, you can't do it because you need the skull exactly to measure the skull. And when you go to reconstruct from a skull, you have the problem you don't know how much skin to put on if you do a reconstruction. Well, we're not dealing with a skull. We're dealing with a person who already has their skin on. And second of all, some of these measurements are, within a millimeter or two, fairly accurate in proportion and don't change with age, because you've got your width of your brow to the to the height of your nose, and if it changed by a millimeter or two, that's fine. We're talking about this is 2 1/4 to 3 1/4, and this one is 5 3/8 to 4 2/8 or whatever. And the point is, it's so off.
Right.
So this little article doesn't actually debunk it. You do have to be careful when you do photo forensics, and they said they got lucky. They got lucky that there were these 2 early photos, both of which were frontal, very high quality, not stretched, because you can tell that there's not really a distortion in the parts of the face. It's not out of focus or anything. And then the later Paul, of which we have many examples of photos where he's frontal or not frontal, and they took these measurements. If the head was a certain way and the jaw was open, they used the head part for this measurement, and the other one they used the jaw closed for, so they did a composite and said, after 66, it's a different guy all the time, and he matches himself. Before 66, it's a different guy, and he matches himself. They don't match each other. Mm-hmm. And right in 67, there are a number of photos that don't match either. They seem to be doctored, and actually, if you have an eye for it, you can see that they've rounded out the face in the Sgt. Pepper inner album cover and so on, to be sort of rounder like the original Paul, but have the eyes of the second Paul. So it's really a photo of the second Paul, but they've rounded him out fakely, like by, if you will, painting away or blocking away what would have been his regular jawline. And then so they say this is definitely a different guy. We do have some photos with Mal Evans that are really good comparisons at plasticmacca, MACCA.com. Now, some of their claims, again, are not as good. They do run with some things a little bit uncarefully. That's not to slam their intention, but they're not. You have to kind of go, this one's a really good comp. This one is not so good for the point, even though I see it. It's not actually a scientific claim yet. Yeah. So the issue is, did people hear it? Now, you had a fellow there in your compilation who was actually Dr. Henry Truby. He came out in 69, 70 when all of this was blowing up in the U.S. and did a voice comparison. It was his specialty. I think he was at UC Berkeley. But anyway, he did this voice comparison where he said there were at least 3 different sounds of voices on it for Paul. We do know that they morphed the voices, so that isn't on its own, unless he knew enough to account for that. That isn't on its own exactly a comparison. But others have done harmonic comparisons, which don't change. Your actual harmonics of your voice they'll leave a pattern,
That's right.
And that's different. And even when you warp a voice, it will warp appropriately to the warping. So in other words, you're warping the whole thing. Like a lens distortion doesn't change the real perspective. It actually changes. You can gather back what the real perspective was by using something that would have been straight, and then say, this is what it would have been without the lens distortion. So if you now find things that are way out of perspective once you take the lens distortion off, which changes everything for the lens, you can actually get back to whether it's a fake photo, if that's one of the things that shows up. And that's actually what shows up in the Zapruder film of this Kennedy assassination. If you take out the lens distortion and you compare frame by frame with what Dallas would have looked like from that point of view mathematically if you didn't have that lens, then you find that some of the actual proportions go out of true. So it's sort of like they made something too straight, it works because with the lens distortion, you still think, well, things sort of, well, I guess they're straight. When you correct for the lens distortion, of course, anything that was straight with the lens distortion will go not straight, and anything that should have been straight before the lens distortion is now straight. So you know you have fake frames in there. So it's actually not just a splicing, dicing, editing job. It's actually a recreated film in which you now have to throw it out mentally and take back only what works. And that film has actually stymied research into Kennedy's assassination up to the point where this was proven by Dr. Costello in this way, where he took account for all of these things and could do it partly with computers and partly with his knowledge of perspective. Dr. Costello found that some of these things, lamppost and the Stemmons freeway sign, are out of true when you correct for lens distortion. And the reason was that right after the assassination, because you did want to get into this a little bit too, right after the Kennedy assassination, Life magazine put out supposedly a frame from the assassination, and in that, the Stemmons freeway sign seems to have been added in haste without lens distortion. So they couldn't not have that frame in there, and if that frame is in there and then all the rest of the frames are accurate, it will suddenly go wonky. So what they did is they moved the Stemmons freeway sign around a bit, and it doesn't really show because they've also got a fake jiggle on the camera. So you don't, when you're watching it, notice it, but it's actually too straight, and it bounces around. And the reason is that one frame had to be in there, right? And so you get this kind of, they're trying to fix something that was a mess up, and they fix it in an even worse way to try to blear the whole issue. And the reason it stymied researchers is that based on various ballistics and medical evidence, and even that has to be sifted through and figured out, and the testimonies, there were things that didn't fit with the film, and you try to refit them to the film as an accurate document, you always got kind of like, well, I guess your research is wrong because, look, it isn't in the film. And now that we know that the film, definitely scientifically based on this kind of geometric analysis, it's not even a feeling or whether the painting looks fake, it's actually that it's a geometrical analysis of the proportion with the lens distortion removed and everything accounted for. When you do that, you see that the film was a recreation, frame by frame. They actually reprojected it. They could do that. Mary Poppins had come out, by the way, the very next year. It was being made in 63. So, I mean, this is not something that they couldn't do. In fact, it's a fairly short, fairly easy film to do. It's actually fairly botched. So back to the Beatles, the Kennedy Association, I think, unless they were approached and said, we'd like you to help, and by the way, it'll help your career, I don't think that they were sitting there being tap-the-stock mind control ops. I think that they were approached really as people, either that were going to help you or they just began to be promoted and it became part of their career, and they may have been semi-witting or not witting to part of that. By the time that Paul died, of course, even then they may not have known the whole thing, but that they would have been approached by Intel wanting to help them. And then they would have known that part of it. I think through the 60s, as they may have witnessed some of what Dave McGowan was talking about, much more cultic activity, more people with bad things. What do you say? I mean, if you're at a party where people are doing 8 balls and after party they're going to, do pedophilia, if you're not invited, you wouldn't know. But if you even know some of this, what do you do? Are you going to immediately go to the cops? You're probably blackmailable yourself. Having been there, you probably realize that this is a partly cop operation. You've been helped with the Paul thing, and you're not likely to come out that way. But I think John woke up. I think he not only woke up in the sense of realized what was going on, as many of them did. I think he woke up in a way that didn't want to be that. And yet, what can he do? And he was also facing his own inner emotional demons, right? So I think that's more the story of how John could lie. I think that that's a very important piece of this, because most people say, John would never. He would just never. Well, actually, under this circumstance, having it build this way, Yeah. And then, of course, towards the end of the 60s, you do get the Stones and Altamont, brilliant piece by Dave McGowan about what may have actually occurred at Altamont, and the alternate film of Altamont, and that George Lucas may have been the person who took the actual, if you will, death film.
He was a cameraman for the Mayles brothers at Altamont, so there's a good possibility that it was him.
Yeah, and so and then you had this guy who said that oh my God, you never believe what I got on film, and he was like an average guy, and then he later said, oh well, they took my film, and so we have these hints, and when we combine it with what we know about these people and their interests, the death of Brian Jones is very interesting. He was dating the very person who was in the car, who was the girlfriend of the brewery fortune, who was he was in the car for the one you mentioned about Lovely Rita, right? I think that some of that is reading things in. I think that some of these things are part of songs, but the car, what do you call it? A Day in the Life, where John is singing about, he was in a car crash.
Yeah.
The immediate inspiration was, of course, the news of their acquaintance friend there, Tara Brown, who was kind of a socialite. He was a member of the peerage in London. He was a high up, but he died in a car crash, and totally bloody, completely ruined, and the girlfriend supposedly was there, walked away, no scratch, no problem. She ends up being the girlfriend of Brian Jones of the Stones, when, of course, Brian Jones is found dead. So, these things, and I don't know if she was manipulated into these positions and kind of being used, but, you find sort of like, well, this doesn't look good. But I do think that the songs show some things. We do have, for instance, John sings in Dig It. He sings about CIA, FBI, BBC, which is sort of stand-in for MI5, B.B. King, Doris Day, and Matt Busby. Well, that doesn't mean that B.B. King, Doris Day, and Matt Busby were all replaced like Paul. It may be, I think the strongest case is for B.B. King at least once. Some of them claim twice because there were two fires. But there is a case made pretty good about B.B. King. Doris Day, maybe, but certainly she was, if you will, an asset or used or victimized by this cultic stuff. Her son is Terry Melcher, who became totally embroiled in the Manson stuff. And so regarding Paul McCartney, it's important to know that there is a major debated leak going on YouTube since 2006. In the early films were very often rehashes of 1960s and 70s news clips and films. It doesn't mean that those are exactly accurate, but they started putting this stuff out again in short pieces called The Rotten Apple. The Rotten Apple series has about 100 videos, all with weird titles and code names and stuff. And the implication from that is not only that Paul is dead, but that there was cultic activity that was using, abusing, and that they were part of to some degree. And they've also come out with about an hour-and-a-half movie, 2-hour movie, called The Winged Beetle, B-E-E-T.
Right, The Winged Beetle.
B-E-A-T.
Yeah. There's interesting film and allusions that this version of Paul McCartney is Aleister Crowley's son, right?
Well, that's part of it, yeah, that he's his son, and or that he really, really is an adherent. You can go to different levels, but that Crowleyitism was a major factor in the development of this alternate story of what happened, and that he actually, by the way, the person who signs his name to Paperback Writer, we have the actual original handwritten thing of Paperback Writer, signed by a guy who called himself Ian Yakimo.
Right.
And Ian Yakimo is also the name given on the early broadsheets, the early newsletters that came out of the Indica bookstore London scene, complete with Mason Avenue and all kinds of other things, where there was an advertisement put out for a sadistic film by a guy claiming that he was a Polish avant-garde filmmaker, and he wanted to make a film with this basically sadistic indulgent, almost cultic approach to filmmaking, and he signed himself, my name is Ian Yakimo, I'm a Polish filmmaker. A little later, there is, though unsigned, there's an advertisement from a filmmaker, it's not actually identified with Ian Yakimo, where he's asking, it seems to be the same guy, asking for a real black magic group. The second Paul has often talked about those years, is still very, very good friends with the fellow who ran that so-called bookstore, who helped him write his biography, his official biography. And they were very into Crowley. They had lots of specials on Crowley. And Paul has talked, or the second Paul, has talked about the fact that he hung out with Burroughs, making tapes backwards. You can hear things, in there. He even said, well, the world is magic with a K. Am I being too far out? So magic with a K is a special way of spelling the word magic, which ties into negative and positive magic participants, and many of your people will know that. So you get this kind of like, this guy's at least into that, right? Maybe the Ian Yakimo that was hanging out at the Indica bookstore before Paul died in early '66. It was, in fact, by '67. It was through the Indica bookstore operation that Yoko Ono had her gallery exhibit, at which John attended.
Right.
And Yoko Ono always claimed to John that she didn't know really about the Beatles, which is just dumb. I mean, that he would fall for that. But she didn't really know about the Beatles and he said several times, she didn't really know about us. Then Paul McCartney II comes on to, what's his name, not Larry King, the so-called bad-mouthed kind of radio host there, Howard Stern, in 2004, I think it was, and says, Yoko came over to my house and she wanted some memorabilia, from the Beatles. And then Howard Stern leaps on it and says, oh my God, I've got a scoop kind of thing. He says, so she knew about the Beatles, right? And he sort of goes, oh, well, I don't really know. And he says, well, I mean, if if she came over to your house, she knew who the Beatles were. And he goes, well, I suppose so. Then at the what do you call it? I'm sorry, my brain is a little dead. I didn't have a good breakfast today. In the rock and roll awards and things, then they begin mentioning it. They begin actually mentioning at I think it was the induction of John Lennon or
the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where the Beatles are inducted and Paul doesn't show up.
Yeah, that was one time. Yeah. And the other time he was inducted, and then John was inducted. So, but in one of those times, one of them mentions, and I think it was Paul, he did give a speech at one of them, and mentions, when Yoko came to my house and so on. Because now it's sort of out, but it's out, and they're trying to take the edge off it. But if you realize that Yoko claimed all through John's life she didn't know, this is very odd. Unless you say, well, she didn't really want John to think she was just some fan. Right, and
she says some very strange things along the way about John. Like she actually will say, she has said, well, this version of John,
right.
And it's like, well, what does she mean by that? This version of John, and she said that before. I mean, she's talking about this iteration of John in his evolution as an artist, or is she talking about this version of John Lennon, who was not like the earlier version of John Lennon, okay? I mean, that opens up a whole other kettle of fish, by the way.
Well, there are people who claim John was replaced and stuff. It's quite clear he was not. His photos are the same, and he's.
Oh, I don't agree with that. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I've seen the latter photos where he's beakish, he's hawkish looking. He looks nothing like the square-jawed young Liverpudlian in the early days. That guy looks very different. Now, you could say that he's aged, but that's a different looking dude. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm open to the possibility that he might have been replaced. I'm less clear or less certain about it than Paul, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. That's my
okay.
Yeah.
I would say I'm open to the fact that such a thing could have been done. but we do see that he was really aging fast. He was quite under a thumb. He seems to have maybe been more into the drugs right to the end, but there is still the boppy person under the slight depressive. He was very afraid of his weight, and the kinds of changes that he went through were not. I mean, beakishness can seem accentuated, but it's not. As actually, it is correct to say you've got to be careful about your impressions from photo analysis. You have to be very careful that what you're doing is medical photo analysis. Like, is this actually a different proportion? Rather than, because of the fat loss, we get a very different feel about the person. We feel like they're bigger or smaller or thinner or whatever, but actually the measurements pan out. Now, I'm a visual artist, so I know you can trick the emotions and the mind to feel that, for instance, a very bright pink isn't so bright. Depends what you put it next to. If you isolate it, you will see it's the very bright pink. So what they did with the Paul stuff is they isolated those factors and said, given the isolation scientifically of those factors, this is a different guy. When you do that with John, the faces match up. They are very much more desiccated. He is very, I think that May Pang's statement is very interesting. After he was with May Pang in L.A., again, in L.A., hanging out and going nutty. I think he was being fed more drugs.
Well, he was hanging out with Harry Nilsson. It's his lost year in L.A., right? And that's what that was.
Yeah. And he was really depressed, of course, about losing Yoko. She was a replacement mother and also his very beloved girlfriend. I mean, to him, that's what she ended as inspiration to him. So there was a lot of love there from him, and he was very depressed. But I think he was also being manipulated out in L.A. Now, May Pang was not the only lover, but she was the young person whom, Yoko Ono, for your audience, they don't know, manipulated into getting involved in an affair with John. She wasn't even interested because she'd seen their spats and their craziness when she was working for them. But as he kind of, put on the make, and he was a loving charmer. He wasn't. There were many women who said, "I never felt afraid with John. I never felt he was a jerk. I did sometimes not want his advances, but I did not feel he was a horrible person." Now she came to love him. She came to love him very much. She's very young. She's about 22, and she said when he went back to Yoko, she said she went to the dentist's office. I guess they had set up an appointment. He'd been missing for about 3 days. She couldn't get through, which you could see as, Yoko and him are reconstituting their relationship and their drugs together. They're hanging out and they're not taking phone calls, except that she said that when he came, she said he was like, she said he was not there. Like, she felt that he was under mind control. Now, is that just Yoko herself having, putting the wiles on John, and there's the resentful May Pang. But John did seem, different after. He certainly withdrew from society, mostly. He was happy again, sort of, but he began to really, really waste away. And by the point where he's getting boppy again and discovering his adult and putting out things with Yoko again, someone bumps him off. And the very, very good pages on this that I've found are at jfkmontreal.com. The fellow there, he goes too much into the FBI. He won't associate with the issue of CIA, and he does tend to think almost everything is a Jewish-related conspiracy rather than a mixed bag. But if you kind of accept and ignore from that stuff, his work on the actual placement of where Chapman was standing and where the doorman was standing is wonderful. The police claimed that Chapman was basically on one side of this archway. It's kind of a long tubular archway, like a medieval, if you will. I did my medieval studies by BA. Like a medieval or Roman arch extended in space. And then there's a doorway on the inside on one side. If you're looking from the outside, it's on the right. On the outside of the archway, this Roman archway, is the stand where the doorman stands, one of those things for a guard. It's a guard post. Mm-hmm. And that is a trajectory if a shooter were there, they would shoot from roughly there into the direction of the doorway inside the arch. Chapman was standing on the opposite side of the arch inside and supposedly hit with four basically perfectly fired shots right around the heart. The doctor said that they were basically holding, there was nothing to attach. Like, it was not even a matter of could we attach his heart. It was like just perfect assassin shots. Mm-hmm. And that went through, of course, his left side, but it didn't go into the opposite wall. It went down and into this doorway, of which we have some photos of a strange bunch of glass doorway that was built out in front of this inner doorway. That would be the trajectory from the doorway man's position, the doorman's position. And his name was not known for years. Finally, it came out that this guy's name was Jose Perdomo. And it had been known that Chapman and this doorman were discussing all day. He actually said, yeah, we discussed the assassination of Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs while we stood there. Now, Jose Perdomo also is the name of the head of Operation 40 anti-Castro Cubans that went into this, the Bay of Pigs for the CIA, thinking it was for themselves and their own benefit, and were left high and dry when Kennedy failed to fall for the bait, even though he was at that point very much an anti-Red, anti-Soviet guy, but he saw it would lead to World War III, and he said no. So Jose Perdomo ends up being the name of the doorman, and we do know that security firms sometimes borrow from those that are quote-unquote ex-military or whatever to be their doormen. So it may be that is how a really good, conscious, and fully functional assassin with the right angle actually got John in such a way there was no way for him to survive. Mm-hmm. Right before, of course, Hinckley and Reagan and all of that were going to be brought in. So, because if John had been around, John knew about he remembered always, that this is. He knew about the drug scene. He knew about the CIA. He probably knew about it before it came out in the House Senate Committee on Intelligence hearings, because he was there in L.A. and he was being fed the stuff, and he would have heard. Right. So he seems to have had very much a kind of a cognizant. He put it together at least to some degree, the way we do, but with less information on some things, but more firsthand information on other things. And seems to have woken up to how he was used, manipulated, and others were. And so this is, I think, part of the story. But the cults are also part of the story, because Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, of course, yes, he believed his stuff, but he seemed to have also been part of this whole intel kind of, loosey-goosey scene. And Polanski and Sharon Tate are connected, of course, to this issue of Manson. Manson claimed Beatles music. The Beatles music in Helter Skelter, very interesting, because in I Am a Phony's movie, if you've watched it, you find very interestingly that when Manson talked about the Beatles music, they did it. There are actually flashing images of letters from Melcher to Manson and Manson to Melcher. Signing and mentioning McCartney and mentioning that they're hanging out together. And for Epstein's death, it's also interesting because in one of the videos, it might be on the same guy's private channel. I Am a Phony is the name of the handle for the group that's putting out these leaks. In their private channel, members channel, which you have to pay a small sum to get part of, very small sum, $6.66, very cute. If you become a member of that, there's some videos in which some of the flashing images in there actually have a letter to Epstein signed by someone calling themselves Beleth, B-E-L-E-T-H. And Beleth is one of the Crowleyite and satanic names for one of their spirit god manifestations, something like that. It's one of the conjuring terms. Mm-hmm. So they were sending a letter to Epstein in the middle of '67 saying, do you want your albums back? Because there were 2 albums that were stolen from Paul No. 2's house. They were Sgt. Pepper's albums. They were called the Twin Peppers. It was acknowledged that these things had gone missing. But what no one knew until I Am a Phony did it is that this letter was from somebody or some group that stole them. Maybe there was more information than Paul wanted out on those things, or maybe the cultic or intelligence didn't want certain things out. And then Epstein turns up dead. Yes, he was a drug user. A lot of these people were, but then you find out that, wait a minute, they're getting these letters. And so this is where I think Epstein comes in. I think they didn't and they did know. I think it was kind of a mixed bag. So the thing about Paul is actually that once you wake up to Paul's having died, you're also learning about what would it take to cover it up and what else was going on around them. And some people are a little less careful, and they just suggest they were directly Tavistock. But I think the Tavistock-type people were using the wonderful, stuff that the Beatles were doing and twisted it and got this agent in there who is a musician and was a Beatle. He is also part of the band. You got to give him credit. But even if he was a fan that wanted to be part of the Beatles, he also was, if you will, pro-Crowley on the side of, if you will, Enlightenment and sick stuff. And he seems to have been meeting with Manson and Melcher. And the Manson operation is a whole other very interesting thing. It seems to have been a kind of a quasi-military operation as well. They cut the wires. Dogs didn't bark. It's very, very strange why all of this went on.
Well, this whole Paul Crowley thing, and this is one of the intimations that Wayne Beetle makes, is that there were two photos of Crowley that they were going to. Well, there was one photo of Crowley, is the young Crowley photo, which is pretty famous. You can see it all over the internet. That they were going to put on Sgt. Pepper, and they didn't put it on Sgt. Pepper because it looks too much like that version of Paul McCartney. That there's too much of a facial resemblance, so they go for the much older version, which, by the way, looks more like Barbara Bush, but that's another story.
Right.
So there is this, and in Winged Beetle, one of the things, Winged Beetle, by the way, is kind of disturbing. Okay.
Yeah.
And not just disturbing in the subject matter, but the way the film is made. There's something at another level, which is very occult about Winged Beetle too. So it's almost like an Inception within an Inception when you watch that movie. You got to be careful, at least from my experience with that film. Watch it, remember that you're watching it, and don't, because there's lots of symbols within Winged Beetle that will really suck you in. But there's this part in Winged Beetle where, and maybe you can help me out with this, Claire. Somebody says, "Oh yeah, this Paul is an even better version of the other Paul." That they're hyping the fact that this guy's got more power than the last one. You know which part of
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. Okay, so first of all, I use it as a research tool. So I don't have the problem so much of, quote unquote, being sucked in, except emotionally to enjoy the artistry of it. I think it's actually a brilliant.
I do too. Yeah. But I also think that there are symbols in that movie, and there's also this very subtle sort of invocation with the music, and it's almost like it is in and of itself kind of a trance-related piece of art, I think, Winged Beetle. But it is actually, yeah. It takes you into a trance, and I just think when people get into trances, they need to be aware, at least that's. And if you are looking at it purely from an analytical standpoint, then at some level you do have some control over your experience with that. I just think that some people who don't have that, who are just looking at it, I don't know. I'm not saying that there's evil intent behind Winged Beetle, but I just think that part of what it's doing is it's trying to get you into a place where these ideas are hitting you at a subconscious level rather than an ontological or in addition to an ontological or an empirical level. And that's my take with it. And if you don't understand symbols, if you don't understand the power of them, sometimes the universal import of the symbol can take on a life of its own. And that's just my own disclaimer with that. And I do recommend people watch it.
Well, I actually have something very important to say about the winged beetle that I think is the most important for research. Well, there's two things. Well, most important for research. But having said that about the artistry, I mean, I'm an artist, and you are playing on getting people into what I call the feel of it. Right. And if you want to convey the fact that even if you don't get this and you're going to wander away and say, oh, it didn't happen, you do want to put out the feel of what it is to be looking at this stuff and know that it has a cultic base. If in fact some of this stuff is cultic, then evoking some of that impression and some of that fear and some of that intrigue is kind of important. It's a little bit, if you will, fictional, or creating a story. I don't mean verbal story. I mean an emotional hook so that you engage with it. Now, the winged beetle, the thing you were mentioning about somebody saying, oh, he's a better Paul than we've had, that's Roby Young. Roby Young actually was not. He was a very interesting guy. He was one of the DJs who actually lost his job for taking this stuff on in '69 and really talking about it. There's some interviews with him available that you can actually hear his early broadcasts, and he's grappling with this. So people are calling in, he's like, yeah, I think we should look at this. Yeah, I wonder what's happened. And, of course, he didn't know it went back to 66. He's thinking, because also in 69, Paul had not really been, the Beatles hadn't really shown up in a lot of press conferences for a while as well then. So he was grappling with it. His interview later, I think they caught him in a fairly enthusiastic mood. I don't think he was spreading disinfo. I think he was responding to the interviewer who was showing incredulity about the idea that Paul had died. And he's going, well, yeah, it's definitely a new Paul. But, hey, he's better than the last one. I like him, whatever. I mean, he's trying to almost bring the person into an acceptance that this is true. And Roby Young actually spoke out, and then he died early. He actually died a few years ago. I have a feeling because he began to want to talk more. He said in another interview, which is in The Winged Beetle, that he'd been to the engagement party between the second Paul McCartney, he thought, and Jane Asher.
Right.
Jane Asher had dated the original Paul from, I think, 65 to 66 or something, and they were pretty steady, even though he was a philanderer. They were pretty steady. Now, she was then supposed to get engaged to the second Paul, and I think it was more of a pro forma thing. But Roby Young was invited as a kind of, a personality from the U.S. who was kind of well-known radio host, and I think it was in New York. I'm not sure. He said that he got there, and here are the rockers, right? And they're hanging out, and there's Paul with this girl, and it's not Jane Asher. And he said to a friend, well, what's with Paul? Again, he's not trying to conceive of a new Paul at this point. He's just sort of, I guess, you're introduced, hey, this is Paul. Oh, hi, Paul. You're not necessarily going, oh, my God, you're a replacement. I mean, it's, your person is, you're not doing that. This guy had a mustache. He seemed young and whatever. And then they said, oh, that's Linda Eastman. That's Paul's girlfriend. And he went, wait a minute, Paul's girlfriend. He's supposed to be. And then it sunk in what he was looking at. This is how people are. It's not like we just wander around and understand things rationally all the time. We get impressions. And he said, wait a minute, this guy is taller and bigger and, wait, he's looking a little gaunt, meaning he's a longer face. Is really so that this is not the same Paul. This is not the same McCartney. So he already, when he was called in 1969, was probably thinking back to his experience and going, wow, I was right. It doesn't mean he was told that he was right. He was sort of beginning to kind of feel it in 67. By 69, somebody calls him. So when he's interviewed in the 70s, he's going, yeah, it's the same guy, and hey, he's great. What's your problem? Not so much like it's okay he was replaced, but more like, deal with it, stop attacking me. I think that's much more where he's coming from. But the winged beetle at the end, the most important research point in the winged beetle is that at the end, they talk about Mal Evans. Mal Evans was the roadie that went with the second Paul down to Kenya, where he seems to have had his first plastic surgeries. Now, that doesn't mean he really looked like Paul McCartney, but they began to create a little bit of a wider cheek and certain things, okay? Not really, really good yet, but kind of. And he doesn't really look like the original Paul either in most photos, but they began to try to change him a little bit. So he goes down to Kenya with Mal, and Mal had written A, a diary, and B, a book. Now, the book went missing, as did Mal's ashes after he was shot in 1976. He was shot in L.A. He was with his slightly disturbed girlfriend, who was upset, or who may have been an agent or whatever, but she called the LAPD saying he has an air rifle. He was shot for having an air rifle, which isn't a dangerous thing, by Charles Higbee, who was LAPD and who was actually, even by his boss. I found newspaper articles in which his boss was interviewed about how disgruntled his boss was at that. Charles Higbee was almost acting like he owned the show. People were taking orders from him instead of the boss sometimes, and he was in charge of supposedly investigating police corruption. Mm-hmm. So if he was an agent of, or on the take, then that would be a perfect guy to have do an operation like kill Mal Evans. Why? Because Mal Evans, according to an interview at the end of I Am a Phony, but again they don't give the source yet, so we'll have to say maybe. According to the source, whoever that is, Mal Evans had called him that day and said, I've just met with Paul. Paul's going to give me royalty credits for having written Fixing a Hole and Sgt. Pepper's with him. Mal had claimed that on radio before, and it is actually, in Wikipedia, it's on Mal Evans's page, but it's not mentioned on the Sgt. Pepper or the Paul's page. So again, it's kind of a buried tidbit that Mal Evans and Paul wrote the Sgt. Pepper's and Fixing a Hole together in 67, so 66, 67. Now, if he had in fact called that very day and was promised royalties, and then he shows up dead in L.A., right? His ashes got lost. He was killed by this guy, Charles Higbee, who is seemingly an informant or on the take, who was heavily involved in the cover-up around the killing of Bobby Kennedy, the LAPD, right? That Charles Higbee was one of the guys who was heavily involved in that cover-up. This is very suspicious. Now, Mal wrote a diary which didn't surface for years. There were rumors there was a suitcase, and then, okay, no, there wasn't. And then the diary surfaced, and only excerpts were published. And now, even that article with those excerpts, I think it was in the Daily Mail, a newspaper in London, have been scrubbed. You can't get that article. There are some quotations from it on Paul is Dead sites. You can read a little bit of the excerpts that Mal did from the diary, but the book was still missing. And I Am a Phony group claims that they have the book, and then they show one page from it. It's a typewritten old page. It's got lots of writing over it. It's definitely Mal's speaking style, his thinking style. He was not an intellectual. He had a certain way of expressing himself, and it's slightly blurred. So they show the whole page once, and then a few seconds later, after a little bit more, they show a segment of the page with a different blurring, so a few other things show up on that flashing image, and if you put the two together of what shows up in each, you get basically that Mal was standing there with John and George and Ringo and Neil Aspinall and George Martin and so on, and they were very upset by something, and then a little bit of blank out, and then you see that it was as if he'd always been with us, is one of the statements, so clearly that's Paul. And then John says, no, don't tell the original drummer, Pete Best. Don't tell him. I don't want Pete involved. And then down at the bottom in the correction notes, typewritten and written notes, which flash later, they're blurred out in the first overall page, but then they flash later. If you catch it on exactly the first frame or two because it quickly pulls out and you don't see it anymore, but you actually see clinic in Kenya, and you also see they did a good job. And so it seems as though Mal Evans's book has been found, that this page is legitimate, and if it is, then Mal was discussing in his book, basically from his own experience, what happened. And he talks about how we were so bummed out we had to get high, how he had to go and tell George, meaning George Kelly, that he couldn't live, that's the butler for the original Paul. He did admit that on radio interviews that he'd actually gotten rid of George Kelly, but usually the story is, well, Paul didn't want George anymore. But in this book, Mal is saying, I had to go and I felt really bad because George never saw Paul again, and I couldn't tell him why. So that's on the page. Now, some of it's blurred out, but that's on the page. And so you get this thing that I think they're legitimate. And I think that though they do use other people's work, some of it is inaccurate. And though they also change some things for artistic purposes to give you a feel for what it would have been like if John had told you, they've actually done a little bit of lying. They didn't use all the sources exactly as they were originally. That if you're aware of that, and it's only a few little places, that you understand how art works, they're trying to give you a feel for what it is, but then in there is the real stuff. They're going to be having a big leak on November 9th this year. They're doing their sort of big, open season comeback. And in the meantime, we have two disinfo ploys. We have one through Highway 69 Entertainment, who may or may not have really gotten a brown paper package with tapes in it. But they did a disinfo piece, or they were convinced of the fact, and they did this thing called The Last Testament of George Harrison.
Right, which you've seen, yeah.
Yeah, which I've seen, and it actually has so many lies and falsehoods about the Paul is dead claims and about the Beatles that it's clearly not just even an artistic change. They are lying. Now, they're also the people that have come out with this thing about Obama's supposedly true father. Now, right. I'm not saying that that guy who was linked to the mother and some of the connections they found aren't accurate. It may well be Obama isn't the actual son of Obama, the father, or it may be that this other guy was, he was, of course, a rabid kind of, well, these people believe what they say most of the time, but he was a cultic guy, actually, among the blacks. He was running, sex.
So you're referring to Frank Marshall Davis, right?
Yeah, and that's come out, and this new movie, Dreams from My Real Father, has that stuff in it, but it also refuses to talk about the birth certificate, refuses to talk about the CIA connection, refuses to talk about the actual Kenya connections. And so what you have here is the same company, Highway 69 Entertainment, is putting out disinfo about Paul is dead, wittingly or not, right. And then putting out partial disinfo, probably partly true, but getting the right-wingers all riled up about this supposed Marxist. You have to realize that Marxism is a combination of good stuff and bad stuff. Marx was attempting to talk about rights for labor. He also was, unfortunately, promoting the ideas of take over everything in order to accomplish it. So the right-wingers can get all up in arms about this connection to Frank Marshall Davis and the possible CIA intel, which may be accurate, and the links to the mother, Stanley Ann, his mother. But it's
Dunham, the last name.
Yeah, but it's taking away the focus from the, if you will, bigger issue of British intelligence, the connection to Kenya, the connection to Afghanistan, the birth certificates. You have to really realize this. Interestingly enough, this Paul is dead thing, when I saw, oh my God, Highway 69 Entertainment did this, that doesn't mean everything in it is wrong. I know, it's just that you really have to watch. So that's one thing that came out right when I Am a Phony stuff was heating up on YouTube. And the second thing that's going to come out is another movie that they want to put out about Paul, and it's so I think that I'm a Phony is actually going to do the, if you will, the real leak. That doesn't mean that they aren't manipulating you artistically, but I don't think they're manipulating you evilly. So you have to watch for the Mal thing at the end. That's the clincher. The whole thing is focused around this book. And if they put out the book, then what you have is you have a testimony of Mal about the Beatles. He was there, and then they might show you a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think that Paul, very interesting, they have Paul saying, Oh, I don't remember those dark nights in L.A. I mean, you fall out of a car into a room. It's very dark. I don't remember. Now,
right.
that's the kind of statement, and he's actually almost like got a little sneer in his voice of what was he doing? And I don't mean John didn't know about any of it or didn't believe in any of it. I'm talking about what was this Paul doing when he was hanging out. So I think this is actually a very serious case. It's not like, seeing Elvis in a donut shop, though I'd be open to the idea that Elvis could have maybe survived an assassination attempt or something. But that doesn't seem to be the case. But with Paul, it seems to be this connection to the intelligence and what was going on later. But they are different issues a little bit. Like, whether Paul died doesn't necessarily mean he was murdered. But once he had to be covered up, then that brings in this other stuff. At least, like at the very least, that would be, your least. And I'm kind of surprised you wanted to talk about the Paul is dead stuff because there's other things at 9/11 and so on. But no, I'm really glad,
I think the Paul is dead is like for me, it's a skeleton key to a lot of things.
Very funny.
Because if you unlock that closet, then you unlock the entire 60s, as far as I'm concerned. And then you begin to get into the level of deception and inception, which took place during the 60s. Because I don't know how much you know about, who I am or what I do, but, part of what I do is a lot of what I do is astrology, and a lot of what I do is metaphysics. And the 60s, especially between 67 and 69, astrologically and hermetically, with the conjunction between Pluto and Uranus, were set to be an incredibly powerful time. And it all begins really in 1963 when Saturn is in Aquarius. And 63 is a turning point for consciousness and culture, as we've seen with the death of Kennedy, with the emergence of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And not only that, Betty Friedan releases her first book on feminism, and it's also when Martin Luther King gives his great speech. So this 1963 with Saturn Aquarius, which is really in some ways esoterically the birth of the age of Aquarius, takes place then. And then, of course, you have the ritual sacrifice of Kennedy, the inception of the Beatles. But what was supposed to take place during that time versus what I would call the esoteric manipulation of that time was the beginning of astrologically and metaphysically a movement towards a global integration and a more of an organic coming together of the world, because that's where the energies were headed. And what happened was that through the death of Kennedy and the manipulation of what I would call the timeline, that those energies were hijacked and used for a very different reason. And then we get into the 60s, and this is when they, quote unquote they, and there is a they knew that this would be a very powerful time for people to come together. The song "Come Together." I mean, there it is, right there, right? And what happens is that we get a brief taste of that, and then all of a sudden we get thrust into this what I would call a planetary initiation, and the Beatles play a huge role in it, an enormous role. And then, of course, we have the Manson murders, and we have Altamont, which is the ritual death of that time and of that period. And I think that this is where, if we get into the whole Paul piece, and if we could disassemble that, then people can look back on that time and they can say, wow, well, our psyches were absolutely, utterly hijacked and manipulated. And to your point, there is a sense of people having to go along with this, at a level that they probably couldn't get out of it. But then there are levels above those people that were, really pushing a particular agenda. And I think the Paul thing is important. And I've talked to other researchers, and it's actually kind of a sketchy area to get into. And, because other people have really gotten into it. I mean, and I get into it tangentially. It is not my focus, although I find it fascinating. I also find it fascinating that there's this whole concept. I'm very into this whole concept of Gemini as an esoteric symbol. And, you know, I don't know how far you've gotten into it, but Kennedy was also a Gemini.
Right.
And McCartney's a Gemini. And we haven't even gotten into the Twin Towers, but they represent Gemini as well. And what's really fascinating is that the Beatles worked on their very first record. The day that they went into the studio was 9/11. September 11th was when they worked on their first record.
And Paul seems to have actually been possibly murdered on September 11th. I was going to bring that up. The thing is that the clue we have to the actual date is on the so-called drum skin or tombstone, which Derek Taylor, who was the spokesperson for the Beatles and so on for years, he actually was caught out on radio once. They have that in the Winged Beetle movie.
Yes,
he was caught out, and he actually said it was a gravestone. And then he said, oh, but we don't know what we're doing. And this is kind of how leaks happen, like people, like with Paul saying, well, Yoko came to my house. Oh, wait a minute, what the heck did I just say, right? So he said that. Now, this so-called gravestone, which on the back of the album, you know, they give all the credits. The credit is given to supposedly a guy named Joe F. Grave, E-P-H-G-R-A-V-E, which is like epitaph and grave. And on there is this, you know, again, one of these album clues. And again, I thought it was all album clues. I thought that this whole thing was people reading into what they thought they saw, and I think some of it is, like the meter maid thing, I think is part of a song. But he was in a car crash and he lost his hair, you know, which Ringo sings in one of his songs. It's a you know, there's this whole, there's some of it is real clues and some of it isn't. But anyway, on this supposed gravestone drum skin thing is if you put a mirror halfway across, some people will know it says, you know, an I, like one, like a Roman numeral I, then the word one, O-N-E, then I-X, then a symbol with an arrow, then he, die. Now they've changed that for the CD cover. They've actually changed the actual font so that the R in Lonely Hearts is longer, and they show this in Winged Beetle. They show that the R is now longer, and so when you do the mirror, it actually says "by." Part of the upper part of the R still shows, and it makes a B-I-E. They've changed it so that it no longer is the clue. But anyway, the original one says 1-1-I-X, he died. Now, the British system of numbering dates is not. It would be November 9th, he died in North American.
Right.
Thing. But in British, it would be September 11th.
Interesting. Very
okay. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was September 11th. Maybe they did an American. Maybe he was kept around. He was still around, sort of, and then they bumped him off in November or something. I don't know. But I'm a Phony's release is going to be on November 9th, but he started the releases on September 11th in 2010. Then last year he came out with an album on October 9th, and now he's going to do the final release on November 9th. So it may be that, you know, he's playing around with these dates, because a lot of people in the U.S. thought it was November 9th, but if it's British, it's actually September 11th, but it's still 9 and 11, 11 and 9. I mean, it's still the numbers.
In there.
So whether the murderers, you know, were known to John at the time, whether they knew who'd done it, whether they figured out and deliberately knew the numerology, they may have already, they may not, they may have figured it out later. Some of this stuff goes on. And I should say something, because I think we end at 3, right? Or 3 my time. We have like 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, you know, I tell you, there is somebody that wants to talk. They've called in.
Okay, can I just very, very briefly mention something?
Quick. Yeah.
Totally briefly. There is a video in the Rotten Apple series. It's called The Rotten Apple, Paul is Dead, 47 and then 2. There's a space between them. They're the numbers. This little short video at about 10 to 16 seconds shows an old film from the Paul is Dead era, the 69-70, where they actually point to, I don't know if it's a promo or it's actually an album of Sgt. Pepper, where on the armband, instead of O, P, and D or P on the armband going around the arm, as we always discuss now, it actually shows OPD frontal. So that clue, even if Paul hadn't died, that clue is an OPD, and there was some other album or promo cover that actually showed it directly in frontal that they got rid of or didn't use after. So I did want people to be aware. They can go and watch that, and you can see the former original version of that photo taken from an early film. And that's also another thing that should clarify. Even if they use an OPP patch and modified it, they did in fact have a frontal view where it's definitely a D in one version, and I don't know what the version is. So go ahead. You wanted somebody to call in.
Yeah, right? Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left in the show, so let's see if they have anything to add here very quickly. Hello, you're on the air with Robert and Claire.
Hey, Robert. It's me, Molly.
Molly, how are you? This is
I had to call in.
Good friend Molly.
Yeah.
We've talked about this quite a bit.
This, this topic is so fascinating to me because the Beatles weren't my era, but I really got taken down by the turn southward, you could say, when I wasn't prepared for it psychically. It really brought me down. But I wanted to bring out, I know you have just a couple minutes, this book, Sinister Forces, and I wanted to see if Claire had read it. The subtitle is A Grimoire of American Political Witchcraft. It's by Peter Levenda. He's an incredible researcher.
I know of it. I haven't actually read it. I know of Peter Levenda. He's a very good writer.
I think it ties together a lot of what you're talking about. The second book is called A Warm Gun. The third is called The Manson Secret. Right. And I told myself I was just going to, because I don't like true crime at all. It scares me, and I wasn't going to really read it. And then I got so absorbed that I read it cover to cover, and it blew my mind. I sent it to Jessica Murray because she's also an astrologer, and she was talking about dark forces under our culture, but kind of not knowing what exactly is going on there. But I just opened up to Bruce Davis, one of the Manson members. He had gone to England for 5 months in April of '69, and he had been seen around the Process Church, and also that I know that that's a connection here with Paul McCartney and the fear issue, which he was involved in, and some of the other Marianne faithful. So I think that we see this, Peter Levin actually calls it the outline of a deeper reality that's happening in coincidence. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. I think you'd really enjoy it because it includes the JFK murder and these alien forces that they were contacting. The first book is called The Nine.
Right.
It goes really deep into every angle. I don't think I've ever read anything that goes as deep as this, as far as like it ties in culture, music, everything. So I just wanted to say that, and I've been enjoying the show, and I'm glad Robert had you on today.
What did you mean by Paul McCartney and the fear issue?
I think that he had been quoted in the fear issue of the Process magazine.
Yes.
And he had said, I don't believe in the end of the world, but I fear, what he was quoted as saying, I fear itself more, or something to that effect.
Right.
And I know there's a connection with Jane Asher and the gallery and the Process Church had been around, or the bookstore, I'm not sure which, but you might know more about that. But I think that if we dug deeper there, there'd be a lot more to find out.
Yeah. I think, thanks. I mean, I think a lot of these people, they were into things. I mean, look, if I pick up a book in an esoteric bookstore and I kind of get into it, and then I think, and I have my own ideas and I think it means this or that. I mean, I actually ran into a Satanist here in Toronto the other day who said, well, I'm just supportive and, and I just kind of, he's obviously not like a big player. He has his own version of what he believes of it, and these Luciferians would have had their own beliefs. I should mention Walter Boert, who did all the wonderful work on mind control. He actually knew Timothy Leary. There is information on several web pages, his actual interviews with Timothy Leary, in which he says Timothy Leary was put into prison, couldn't be found for a while. His wife didn't know where he was. When he came out, he was black and blue. He'd been beaten up, and Boert confronted him and said, are you CIA? And it was the one time, because he's never actually admitted he was CIA, and he said very proudly, well, of course I was. I am. This is a good thing. And he said, you realize, they beat you up. And he said it was the only time he saw Timothy kind of sort of stumble, like as in what I'm doing might be not so good. You see, right. You always have to think, he probably thought he was ushering in the new, as Robert was saying, cool age, but helping corral it so it didn't get out of hand. And that's how a lot of these, what we call agents, but they're agents of an idea. They're less so much.
I'll say one more thing, and then I'll end but I want to say Robert knows it was Neptune Scorpio at that time, and that's the mood I was born into also, and I think that was part of the exploration, the cult and all that. It was part of the spiritual evolution, you might even say, and so I don't see it as dark unless there's murder attached to it, and that really is dark. Well, thanks again for being on, and I'll close now, or I'll
hey, Molly, Molly, thanks for calling. I'll catch up with you, okay?
Okay, bye, Robert.
Bye. Hey,
Some
Claire.
of this is really ugly. Yeah, it is really ugly, but we are waking up, so it's not a complete bad thing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, listen, Claire, I loved having you on. I'll have you on again some other time. We'll talk about maybe the free energy, which is really important, and maybe where it could all go to get us out of this
Cool.
this third dimensional trap that we're in. Okay.
And thanks to Molly.
Yeah. So take care of yourself, and I mean that in all earnestness, body, mind, and spirit. And keep up the good work, and we'll catch up with you somewhere down the line. Okay?
You too. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye. If you're listening now, you're listening to the recorded portion of the show. That was Clare Kuehn, researcher from Canada, and you've been digging into the mystery of Paul McCartney. And you may or may not believe that the Beatle known as Paul has been replaced, or is a different person than the one who started with the lovable Fab Four, the four young men, lads from Liverpool. Or you may believe that something is afoot, and it's up to you to figure out if that's true, and if so, what does it mean? Does it mean anything to you? Or is it just yet another cul-de-sac of truth here on a very mysterious planet during a very strange time? Or perhaps it's an epiphany, and a very important epiphany at that, a revelation into where we've been, what's now taking place, and potentially where we're going. As always, it's up to the individual. And to that extent, use your head to discern what's real and your heart to stay open to what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. You've been listening to the Friday Farcast. Again, I want to thank my guest, Clare Kuehn, for going down the rabbit hole with Paul McCartney, a.k.a. Plastic Maca. I'll see you on Monday with the mashup.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.